Well, hello, and thank you all for joining us. We have guests from around the country: Maryland, Florida, New Jersey, Colorado, Texas, and Pennsylvania. And we've all gathered on this webinar tonight to talk about student data privacy. And we're really thrilled to have education leaders and parents from across the country who are really effectively looking at how our student data is mined, shared, sold, and leaked. And we know that there's a lot to learn about this. It's a growing industry. It's very dynamic. There's a lot behind the data curtain, and we're just in the process of unpeeling that. So I first want to say welcome to the Uniting for Kids webinar on data privacy. And thank you so much for joining us and all the work that you're doing in your part of the woods. We've got a real quick format tonight that we're going to follow. We'll start with introductions, a 3-minute introduction from everyone. And I'll maybe flag you if it looks like that 3 minutes is going a little bit long. And then what we'll do is have some facilitated follow-up questions that might be directed to specific guests. Not everyone will have to necessarily comment on that, but we're hoping for a fluid dialogue. And then after that, we'll open it up for Q&A from those parents that are participating in the conversation tonight as well. And from there, we'll have 1 minute for a final thought, and we hope to end at the end of the hour. And we thank you again for joining us. We'll just go ahead and get started right away with Sherry Kiesecker from Colorado. Sherry, welcome.
Hey, thanks Angela and Uniting for Kids for hosting this. I am a mom from Colorado. I have 2 kids, one's high school, one's middle school. And I'm a really average mom. I'm was not politically active at all, but was very active in my kids' school and volunteered a lot. And probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I ran into another set of parents who kind of tipped me off to this whole data collection thing that was happening. At the time, we had In Bloom, which was a big company that was funded primarily by Bill Gates, that had started a data dashboard in a few different states where they were collecting data from student data and handling it for teachers. But the concern was that it was leaving the school. And the more that I got involved with that group, the more I found that there's so much information leaving the school that parents aren't aware of. And that's primarily what I do, is try to spread the word to other parents and say, look, your child's data is an extension of them. It's just like if they're at school and they're writing an essay, that's their work. And if their health records are included in their education records at school, if they have special needs and that information is in there, or they're gifted and talented, all of that information in their education record can be shared outside of the school, and parents aren't aware of that. And the reason that that can be shared is because there was a law, it's a 40-year-old law, that was put in place to protect children's data, and it's called FERPA, the Family Education Rights Protection Act. What happened in 2011 was that got changed. And it got weakened. And parents often hear that their children's data is safe in the school and it's not shared, but what they don't hear is the new exceptions. And if a school or an education provider or the state decides that they want to share that with somebody, they can authorize that sharing, and it can be with outside agencies, it can be with companies, and like you said, Angela, that data can be sold. Some states are starting to get laws to prohibit the selling of data. However, I can tell you our state of Colorado just passed a law last year for student data privacy, and student data is not supposed to be sold. I still get flyers in the mail with my children's name on it, saying your child should come here for this, this school, or we cater to children with special needs, come visit us. And so I know that they've gotten my children's information. And I think if parents were aware that there are so many ways for data to leave the school, and every state has a longitudinal database, which means every year your child's information is put into that database, and then that state database can further share to researchers, to whatever. And the problem that we're seeing now is the data being collected is more not just your grades. It is everything about a child, how they feel, their personalities, every survey they've taken. So you wouldn't want to share that on the street, yet it's being shared without your consent. And I think the number one thing parents should say is that's my child's data, and I would like the law changed to give me consent to how that data is collected, shared, and used. It should be transparent, and you should have consent over that.
Exactly.
Angela, you're on mute. Angela, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you so much.
There you go.
Thank you very much, Heather. Alice, we're going to turn it over to you. And how do you pronounce your last name?
It's Linehan.
Linehan. Alice Linehan. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Alice Linehan, and I am a mother of 3 from Texas, a state that said no to Common Core national standards, but a state that said yes to college and career ready national standards. And we really didn't have to comply, I guess, with the Common Core national standards because we've been implementing it in Texas for a long time. And as a mother of 3, I started looking at this issue. I was involved kind of in the grassroots movement in Texas. I was involved in volunteering for campaigns and getting people elected who I thought were would be in a position to protect our children. And what is interesting is those very people that I had worked really hard, volunteered for, to get elected, when I started asking them, why did you pass this legislation or why did you sponsor this legislation, I became enemy number 1. Mm-hmm. And I volunteer with an organization called Women on the Wall. And we have had conference calls every Wednesday night for the last 4.5 years.
Wow.
And we've had experts from across the country who have called in and given us information. We have a wonderful lady, Donna Garner, who has really helped me to understand. And during the last legislative session, the last 2 legislative sessions, there were bills that were being passed that I didn't quite understand the danger of them, but now I do. And I shared in the chat room an article and a chart where we have basically charted Texas's compliance to this shift in education that allows for our children's data to be collected without parental consent in the name of education research. And if you think about it, the term TQM, Total Quality Management, which is, a business model for accountability. And if it's a product that you want to sell, you want to have consistent quality in that product. When you think of TQM and you think of the child as the product, as a mother, that infuriates me. And so when you look at key legislation, in the last several sessions, there have been 3 major pieces of legislation. HB 5 was set up the school to work pathways to graduation. And the way that HB 5 was passed was the narrative, get rid of the test. We've got to get rid of the STAR test, those end of course tests, which are invalid assessments. But that's how the narrative that they used to bring in HB 5. Then you had Senate Bill 6 that opened up the door for our instructional materials to completely comply with the Common Core national standards. Then we had HB 2103 that set up these education research centers that had access to all of this data. So when you marry these bills, you basically set up a data collection currency for the state of Texas, where the Texas Education Agency, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, which is the research centers, and the Texas Workforce Commission have access to our children and their teachers' personal data without consent. And most of us who've been in this battle, we understand now the term P20W.
Yeah.
That they have basically set up the P20 system in Texas, where they have access to our children's data from preschool through the workforce, and our children are seen as human capital. The last thing that I'll mention, just last week, Senator Larry Taylor, who's very much a part of pushing all the school choice bills here in Texas, got through the Senate Education Committee the Senate Bill 22 that basically amends the Texas Education Code to set up these pathways in technology in early college high school. And when you look at what Obama set up with his restructuring of the high school model, where you don't go to school based on your zip code anymore, all of this legislation that's happening at the state level complies with everything that is happening at the federal level now that ESSA has passed. And more importantly, or as important, is WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act.
Okay. All right. Thank you. It's a lot of legislation, and yet we're seeing similarities between the states. So I think that's something that we really need to pay attention to, and I'll follow up with some questions about that too. So next I want to hear from Cynthia Boyd.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to Uniting for Kids for hosting this. So I'm a parent of 3 children in Baltimore County, Maryland. And I have to be honest, I think I'm probably one of the newest people to this whole issue, I think, on the call tonight. I have 3 children, and really my learning curve on this issue began as our district, which is over 100,000 kids, started rolling out a one-to-one initiative. We're in our 3rd year of that, called Students and Teachers Accessing Tomorrow. And it currently is giving 1st through 6th grade in all schools their own device for what is called sometimes a student-centered learning initiative, with personalized learning, and a lot of vocabulary that I've had to work to get up to speed on. But so it was really striking to me, and very early on, I started having questions about what programs and applications my children were using and how much time they are spending using the programs and apps through technology at school and for homework, and really had to make an effort to make sure I understood sort of all of the things they were using. And along the way, became increasingly interested in who their data was being shared with and what exactly was being shared. And, you know, for us, that sort of has fallen into a few categories, one of which is the actual vendors of the district. So these are the places that our school system has contracts with, that, a larger amount of data about our children is shared with. And there's really a long list of companies that fall under those categories. But in addition, there's also the apps or tools that are used by schools or by individual classrooms that don't have a specific contract with a company. Some of these are approved centrally for use by our district, but some of them actually can be used if an algorithm is followed about what kind of data the apps or programs would use. And one of the things which it took me a long time to really understand was that actually the choices you made about sharing directory information actually affected what information was shared with those programs that are not ones that our district is actually contracting with. In addition, our district has been very interested in using social media for a spreading of good news in general, but this has also it led to students' information being shared over social media by the school system's employees themselves. And I think by over the past year, a lot of people, actually probably the last couple of years, a lot of people have been asking questions, and there's a lot of recent and ongoing changes to the district website that are providing more information about student privacy. I think that we here still have a long way to go in terms of really educating parents and parents really understanding issues around data privacy. In addition, our Maryland and our school system, there's continued to be a lot of interest, particularly in health issues around using technology in school, probably particularly in elementary school, but actually true all the way up through high school when we think about sleep and how can students who need to who need to do schoolwork, how can they adhere to the recommendations that, for instance, you avoid looking at screens in the hour before bedtime. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody else.
Thank you, Cynthia. Heather Hicks.
Hi. Okay, so I'm coming at this from a different angle because I first got involved with this whole cause based on my son's experience with personalized learning, and then as a teacher using different apps and programs in my classroom. I see a different perspective, and I think it's really important for fighting this that we think about not only the data but the negative effect and impact on learning, because I think that may have even more of an impact on people when it comes to legislation. So I'm going to touch on how these things are sneaking into school a little bit, but also just I think it's important to remember the very powerful force that data really is. We have to remember that it's rooted in Common Core, which was always about money, and it's like toothpaste that you can't put back in the tube. So it's here, and we can't put it back in, as you all know. There's very little control over the amount or types of apps and programs that students are using. Teachers have tremendous amount of flexibility in that. We're evaluated more highly by incorporating more technology in the classroom. And so seemingly harmless, fun, free resources are constantly creeping into the classroom. They may or may not have a login, but if you're logging into a device, then you're logged in. You might hear the term common assessment thrown around a lot. That's a big push in districts, and districts are getting grants and funding for using digital assessments such as TS Gold, which is continuous assessment for infants through 3rd grade, and now it's moving on up to 5th grade with video, photos, narratives about each child's academic and social emotional progress, loaded up to an outside database along with their first and last name, their birth date, and that's 3 times a year. Districts want to show that students are taught the same things in the same ways at the same time. And of course, that's the exact opposite of how any parent or teacher would define personalized education. But as a result, schools are turning to digitalized assessment and personalized learning without even informing parents. Programs like iReady and iStation include assessments and learning modules. They generate plenty of data, and kids passively watch basically cartoon lessons. It's really a tragedy. Are the districts sneaking this in intentionally? I don't think they're all being sneaky on purpose. Some are, for sure. Others just really are swayed by the slick marketing, and they are just believing that the data is going to be safe. And of course, now we're seeing that there's no conclusive improvement in learning because of Common Core or integrating digital technology, but the market's already been unleashed, as Gates put it, and the toothpaste is out of the tube. And I want to close by explaining the powerful force of all the data mining. At a recent session of the European Parliament in Brussels, this was from November, it was called Algorithmic Accountability and Transparency in the Digital Economy. Dana Boyd, who's a Microsoft researcher, explained that in the next 10 years, data-driven technologies will be the main objective. She named autonomous vehicles, personalized learning, predictive medicine, and predictive policing as the goals. Another panelist explained that this trend toward automation means that a pilot no longer needs to know how to pilot a plane, but instead must know how to deal with the automated system when it fails. So the need for this data is unbelievably strong, and I believe that if we can make our case that it's also hurting students academically, that we'll have a better chance of fighting it.
Thank you, Heather. I just want to know, are there any other panelists or guests that are also educators? No, okay. All right, terrific. Well, thank you, Heather. I've got a follow-up question for you for sure. I want to ask you about,
but I'm not currently
teaching. Okay, thanks, Kayla. Heather, one of the questions, I'm just going to ask it right now, but so you can have some time to think about it, is, you know, when people say data and technology is the new way for education, and we as advocates for children say, no, it's not, I think what the question is, well, then what's the alternative? And so what I'd like to ask you as an educator is, when education was working, what did that look like before technology came to drive all aspects of learning? And I'll get back to you because I definitely want to hear from our next guest, who's Deb. And Deb, is it Herbage?
It's Herbage.
Herbage. I wanted to make you French.
It's okay. Everybody does that.
Thank you, Deb, for being here. We appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. My name is Deb Herbage, and I live in Florida. I got involved in this 3 years ago. My daughter came home from school telling me how she hated school, and that was so unlike her. So that got me curious as to why she suddenly hated school. That's what got me involved in this whole Common Core. I decided to go and download the contract, the AIR contract that Florida signed with the American Institutes for Research. And I was absolutely floored after I went through the 2,000-page document and some of the things that came out of that contract. I was just absolutely shocked, especially around the data mining and the security and data privacy. In the actual contract, it says that the researchers and vendors and stakeholders, I love that word stakeholders, because nobody can ever define who those stakeholders actually are. So I've been very, very involved in my district. I attend all the school board meetings. I have a blog. I do try to bring awareness to this data mining and the data privacy violations that are going on. I am in complete agreement that I feel like them data mining our children, it's like they're stealing something from our kids without our knowledge. It's not like they're asking permission to take this data, they're just taking it without even asking parental consent. I actually have a website, a Facebook page rather, called The Resistance. Sherry's in my group. We have a lot of pretty powerful people in the group, and I would like to invite some of you all to be in that group with us. There's a lot of information sharing, but one of the things, I fired off an email on Friday to our district, and I asked the questions, you know, what is Pasco County doing to protect our kids' data? Who actually is in charge of protecting our kids' data? What infrastructure does Pasco County have in place to protect against hacking? what steps have Pasco County taken to ensure our kids' data is safe? What are the steps Pasco County has in place if there is a hack or a breach? Those types of questions.
Mhm.
So the director of communication reached right back out to me the same day and said that she would get the answers to all my questions. I feel that if parents did this in the districts that they live in and start holding these districts accountable, I know a lot of districts across the country, they're appointed officials, but I just so happen to live in a district where they're actually elected. So we can hold these elected officials accountable for some of this. And it's appalling to me. My daughter, she uses an iPhone, so she's connected to my phone. So I'll be sitting at work and all of a sudden it'll say, Abby needs permission to download such and such app. Well, that happens, 2 or 3 times a week. So I'm actually shocked at how many apps and different software she's using. So now my next step is going to be to find out exactly what programs she's using, what apps she's using, and then I'm going to go and look up the privacy and the data sharing rules or regulations for all of these companies. I feel like, I almost feel like a rape victim in a way where like we're being violated. Our kids are being violated. I mean, I wouldn't go that far as to say that, but it's quite intense, and it really infuriates me that they just do all of this, without even getting parental consent or acknowledgement. Living in Florida, I call this ground zero because Jeb Bush and his foundation is here.
Mhm.
And he is the driving force behind a lot of this education reform. It's almost like Jeb Bush, whatever Jeb says goes. Some of these, like the VAM, for example, the accountability program that they have tied to the tests, the test scores where they actually evaluate our teachers and grade our schools. The A through F grading, that was Jeb Bush's brainchild.
Is
Mandatory
he Ed
third-
Inc? Is it Ed Inc? Is that his organization?
No, it's actually, he has 2. It's FEE, which is the Foundation for Education
Excellence.
and Excellence in Education.
Uh-huh.
And then he also has one that's called the FFF, which is the Florida's Future Foundation.
Okay.
So he runs both of those. And people seem to, they're like dogs with their tongues out, whatever, waiting for the next move. Whatever Jeb says goes, and everybody seems to jump on it. So I feel bad because a lot of these mandatory third grade retention, the A through F school grading, a lot of these policies have been pushed out to other states thanks to Jeb and his foundation.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, it's really easy to go look at their agendas and where they spend their money and, what legislation they're forwarding to really find out who's behind that. And it's real easy to make the connections about who benefits. It's just that we're living in a climate where we as parents are a lot of times overwhelmed, and doing that digging, it's just one of those things that a lot of times we, in the midst of our overwhelm, we don't have the time to go check those out. And yet it is really so blatant about who is really working to exploit children, what the purposes they serve. And it's not hidden or concealed. It's really kind of right out there in the open. So Deb, was there anything that you wanted to add, or can we move on to the next person?
Nope, you can move on.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. And Allison, you're going to close us out in terms of your introduction, and then we've got a few questions. So we're right on schedule, and I thank you, everyone, for being concise.
Oh, great. So again, thanks so much. I'm Allison McDowell. I have a daughter who's in high school here in Philadelphia. So my perspective is coming from an economically disadvantaged district. And I got involved in education activism around the United Opt-out movement and the end of high stakes end of year testing, and realized increasingly that the move after ESSA was towards these embedded assessments within the curriculum, which was really going to drive more and more online curriculum. So I've been opting out of a lot in Philadelphia, but I think I'm one of maybe like a couple of parents who are aware that you can opt out of things. So my daughter's in a magnet school. And so for the most part, the modular personalized learning, we're not seeing that. That's in her school. In Philadelphia, it's more in the turnaround schools. So in the schools where students really need human connection, they're being like distanced and put into these sort of adaptive learning programs that are doing a lot of the data mining. But even within her school, they used a lot of our Title I money last year to do Chromebook, dropping Chromebooks in schools all over our district. And there were two tracks. You could either have like an open-ended track if you were an autonomy school with like freedom, or you could, if you were a turnaround school, you had to use your Chromebooks for these modular, Compass Learning is one of the programs. So even though her school took the use it for your own research purposes Chromebooks, the reality is the student ID numbers in Philadelphia, the school uses Google email accounts. And so all of the student assigned email accounts are their student ID numbers. So my understanding is like within the context of FERPA, for FERPA protection, everything that the kids do once they log into that Chromebook is tracked to them and their unique ID number and available for research purposes. So it's what they've accessed on their Chromebooks, the Google Drives, any emails they send. I mean, it's really vast, potentially, the amount of information. And I was aware that Harvard had done an attendance study for Philadelphia School District, where they extracted essentially every bit of information out of kids' records for research purposes. So we opted out of that, but most parents aren't aware. Naviance is another big issue. It hasn't come up yet, but that's pushing sort of the workforce readiness right down into middle school. So there's lots of very intrusive surveys of students and their interests, academic records. I know in some states they've actually required them in order to graduate. That isn't our case in Pennsylvania yet, but Naviance is something to keep your eye on. And then I'll just say, sort of in closing, I think we need to think about this digital learning platforms and the data collection. People say, well, kids need to know technology. And for me, looking at technology, is it something where children are consuming content that is determined for them by an algorithm? Or are they in charge of the content, they and their teacher, a human teacher, in terms of using that technology to create things? So if your child is spending all this time with devices that need to learn your child and collect their data to work properly, for me, that's a problem, because that's essentially saying that children can only access the education that the algorithms say that they can access. And then the teacher is marginalized. And for us, increasingly, they're using technology to justify cost-cutting savings and not hire teachers and then just give online subscription programs and say, well, we can't hire a teacher, but we can give you a smart board and an online class subscription. So I think that's my closing.
Okay, great points. Great. You talked about a lot of stuff that I want to get back to. So I have a couple questions because, in the legislative circles and in the community circles, these things come up, and I'd like to hear from you, and I'd like to hear from people, and I want everyone to be just as succinct as possible. So one of the questions is, adults, we as adults are on our smartphones, and we are accessing all kinds of technology on a regular, ongoing basis. And yet we know that a lot of our data is being collected and profiled and shared and sold and then used to market and advertise back to us so that we'll spend our money. We know that. And yet many of us willingly concede our privacy for the technology and for the convenience and for those tools. So my question to all of you is, what do you see? Let's assume, because we already have the evidence to support that our children's data is being mined, sold, distributed, leaked, shared, and collected to then use to market back to teachers, school districts, parents. And what is the danger in that? And I want to be really specific. What is the danger of our students information being sold. Deb, you talked about, you used the analogy of feeling like it was rape. And I think, a lot of times it does. It feels like technology has really allowed these companies a window into our children's private bedrooms, what their ideas are, what their thinking is, what their goals are, how they learn, what their disabilities are, what their mental health challenges are, whatever those are. But this is the so what question. If we all accept that assumption that we have data companies that are predatory towards our children, what's the danger of that?
I think the danger of that is that our kids are being labeled and sorted without them even knowing it. That's the way I look at it. Our kids, innocently enough, could use this game for school. They're told to download this app and use it for school, which appears to be, a game, OEM, is that what they call it? And not even realizing it, but their every keystroke, whatever they do in this app is being collected.
So,
without them knowing.
And in that process of being labeled and sorted, tracked, that P20 and that total alignment, what that does then is reduce their opportunities, their future opportunities,
Absolutely.
rather than expand them. Okay,
Yep.
who else can answer that question? What's the danger for our children?
I'd like to say, what is the purpose of an education paid for with tax dollars? In my opinion, I send my kids to school to learn to read and write, do math, know history, so that when they graduate, they have an equal opportunity at success in life because they have a solid foundation of education and they can go get a job. What this does is it hands our kids over. With Women on the Wall, we gave the call to action for parents to go into the schools and ask 3 questions. Can I see what you're teaching my child? Can I see how you're teaching my child? And can I see who's financially benefiting from the curriculum products on which my child's teacher is being evaluated? Our schools are being used for profit for public-private partnerships. They're not being used to educate kids to learn to read and write and do math.
Excellent. Thank you, Alice. I'm going to repeat those questions again because I do think those are the 3 primary questions that we need to be asking of teachers, school districts, legislators. What's being taught? How is it being taught? And for whose benefit? And I agree wholeheartedly that one of the things that we've seen in this kind of technology-oriented and data collection emphasis is a shift in purpose, so that it's not about how do we serve the needs of our children, but our kids ultimately become product testers for these software, these apps, these tools. And the information isn't used to improve their experience. It's used to improve and market the product.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the most significant dangers in data privacy, the issue around data privacy. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question? I have a few, just know.
I would love to just add that, there's already studies, which I don't know off the top of my head. I'm not that great with the details, but I'm sure Sherry or somebody probably already knows, but there are already studies showing that kids who see on, say, social media that they have so many likes, they'll actually change the way they think and change their opinion. So I think the danger is it's going to change the way people think, not by their own free will. They don't even realize that it's changing the way they think. Another study was done on telling people that they were receiving personalized advertisements, even though they really weren't. And the people who were told that they were getting personalized advertisements liked the products, thought better of their own taste, and changed the way they thought based on what they were told. So I think that that's a huge part of this, the data that's going out and then coming back at them in a new way. It will change the way they think. It's like advertising times a million.
Yeah.
You know?
So what essentially is happening is that our children, rather than being educated and becoming critical thinkers and able to participate in a democratic society and be parents and nurturers and all of those things, are really being socially engineered to become consumers.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name's Shari. I just wanted to say that I think with the amount and type of data that's being collected, not only is there a very strong data movement overall, but in the background now is the data badging and credentialing movement, which is not spoken of really. And it's really hard to get answers on that. But I think essentially what's happening is with all the data being collected both inside the SLDS and all the data warehouses being linked together, essentially there are profiles being created on all students, and I think it's going to be used as a negative, not a positive necessarily, because just based on the workforce alone, it can be used to prevent students from getting jobs in the workforce,
Yes.
particularly based on algorithms. I mean, it happens in modern day. You know, you send your resume out and an algorithm will search for keywords. You may be the perfect candidate for the job, but if the algorithm doesn't pick up a keyword, your resume is tossed to the side. So I don't think it's a positive at all, and I don't think anyone's taken a step back because they're just driven by making money, and our kids are suffering ultimately.
Yeah, thank you, Shari. I appreciate that point, and I think that as time goes on, we're going to see more and more examples of that. It's data profiling our children. That even when we talked in our last webinar about opting out, we had 2 parents that were minority parents that had children that were excelling in, for example, math. And then because the measurement tool, the state measurement tool said that they weren't proficient, then they were put in remediation courses. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing is these are eugenics tools, that they are biased. And so when they do profile a child, they are racially biased and they negatively profile children of color. And oftentimes, you know, boys or girls or kids that learn in a different way. Kids that are English second language learners are specifically targeted and mislabeled, and children that have both at the high-end abilities and disabilities. It does not, you know, accurately capture them. And so they aren't valid tools. And to make conclusions that then affect their learning opportunities later is really destructive to those children. It's counter to what the whole design of public education was supposed to be, as the great equalizer. And it functions a lot like segregation in terms of limiting opportunity and reducing the amount of resources to the children that really begin with the fewest resources and opportunities. So thank you for that comment too, Shari. I think there's a lot of danger in this whole aspect of data privacy. I want to get to a couple other questions. So one of the, you know, how this gets put through, and I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of these initiatives are connected to ALEC. And ALEC is then funded, you know, by the big business industry, who then forwards legislation that creates opportunities. But one of the things that strikes me is that they say we need to know. Legislators say we need to know. These data pushers say that we need to know. And I always, when I meet them, I always say, "Hi, my name is Angela Engel. How's my child doing?"
Right.
And the truth of the matter is, they have no idea. I was going to curse right there, but I try to remember that this is a professional webinar. So, but the reality is they have no idea, and we've been supplying them for 2 decades of data. And when you ask them how are our kids doing, they still don't know. And the reality is they're never going to know. And guess what? They don't need to know.
Right.
Parents need to know. Students need to know, and their teachers need to know. And outside of that, no one else needs to know. And so what are some other responses that we can say when they say, no, we've got to have the data, we need those measurements? What are some of the other responses that that we as advocates and leaders can offer?
I'll speak to that if we can for just a minute. I think that the amount of data is something that legislators and most people aren't aware of. They don't realize that it's every keystroke across a lifetime can be collected and put into the same data bag. And so you're taking data about a toddler's bathroom habits being collected by, kindergarten readiness assessments like TS Gold. And does a legislator really need to know that? Do you need to have pictures of my toddler to determine if he's going to be ready for the workforce? I think this workforce readiness starting clear from preschool, wanting access to that data, they don't need to have my child's personal information on such a large scale. Sure, if they want to know my child's grades, as long as it's aggregate, they can get an idea and they can see trends. They do not have to have personally identifiable information on each child starting from preschool all the way through age 20. And that's the SLDS, and that's the paperwork data. That's what I like to say, paperwork data. But the thousands and thousands of data points collected every time they're online, that can be used to predict. So they can take things like their IEP, their religion, their race, their demographics, and they can say, this child's return on investment would be XYZ. They're less likely to go to college. We shouldn't spend the money on them. And it's that type of predictive profiling where parents can't even see the data, yet they often say, well, we want to empower parents with data. Parents don't see those data points, and I guarantee you walk into the school and you say, let me see the data points collected on my child today. The school doesn't have that. The legislators don't have that. The companies that collect the data, they have that. The programs like Naviance that ask you to waive your FERPA rights so that they can collect this data and further share it, they have, if you upload information, you're a high school student and you want to go to college, you have to upload information to the Common App, say, so you can get a college application and you want to apply for scholarships. All of your parents' financial information is now in there and shareable. Mm-hmm. If you think about every information you have ever submitted, every registration, and consider that to be shared, there's no need for them to have that amount of data.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you, Sherry. I want to just hit on a couple of points because one, our district did a study and looked at how many reports were required by state and federal government. And this was years ago. And so I know it's huge, but it had a 605% increase in the reports that they were required to file with federal government and the state government. And so really what's happened in the whole data world with our children is that there's very little time that's going into instruction and preparation and the learning. And most of it is going into the accounting and the reporting and the data collection aspect of it. You guys talked about predictive profiling, and Heather, you mentioned this, but all of the research on predictive profiling is that it doesn't work. It does not work, and it's because all of these measurement tools are conflicting and they give different outcomes. And so whenever people say we're trying to predict, why? Our kids are in the early stages of development. They don't know who they're going to be. We don't know who they're going to be. The point is not to predict who they're going to be. The point is to give them as many opportunities and resources for them to explore who they're going to be. But that whole idea of being predictive about the human capital and being able to predict isn't that far-fetched. We saw it in the Soviet Union decades ago. China exercises that. So the fact that we, as a free country, that the United States are moving in a direction where they are claiming that, outside of those family units need that data, and that so that it can be predictive and so that students can be tracked. We ought to be up in arms about that. Up in arms. I mean, that's so crazy. It's the craziest of crazy. Okay, I want to turn it over. Alice, I see your hand up, so I'm going to let you say something, Alice.
Chomping at the bit here.
Okay.
Just so people know, there is the Commission on Evidence-Based Policy Making that is making its way through Congress now, and they are looking to lift the ban on student unit data at a federal level. Now, I want to put a name. We talk about these organizations, ALEC, the Aspen Institute, all of that. Texas has been involved in this for a long time, as I said, and the Laura and John Arnold Foundation is, John Arnold made his billions of dollars when Enron fell. He's a hedge fund guy.
Oh, okay.
He has committed to put $4 billion into predictive analytics. And predictive analytics mines education data to create software programs that have the ability to predict the behaviors of students.
Yeah.
This is key because there was a memo, and Allison, I don't know if you're the one that found this, or Lynn, one of us found it, but they have started a coalition for evidence-based policy in Washington, D.C. And they had a memo that they put out. We are now entering a new and exciting phase over the next couple of weeks. The coalition will join the John and Laura Arnold Foundation, opening up a Washington, D.C. based evidence-based policy and innovation division. Why this is scary is because their money is also what is putting commissioners of education into place. In Texas, Mike Morath, who is our appointed commissioner of education, who we're trying to get out, we can tie the dots with him being put in that position from the John and Laura Arnold Foundation. If that's happening in Texas, that's happening in state after state after state.
Yes.
So be aware that it's not, and this is not a right or a left, a conservative versus liberal. They've all been paid off, all sides.
I agree. And we can't fight it from a political party perspective. We've got to fight it from a unified parent perspective. So I appreciate you making that point too, Alice. I have a couple more questions, and I really want to get to them because I think, we need to make the point about why technology is bad for kids. And Heather, I started that question. And I also, if there is a really critical question that a parent wants to ask, could you please type that in our chat section so that I can field those? Heather, do you mind, a lot of times people say technology is good, it's the information age and it allows access. What did education look like before we went into the data frenzy that worked for kids that isn't working now?
What immediately popped into my head when you said that before is that education is about developing citizens, and I think that is what's lost. So now we've forgotten that, and now they're back reaching and they're using that to get more data by saying it's social emotional learning. Now we have to backpedal. But basically, I think that, used to be teachers and schools were developing citizens focused on educating them about their local community, their local area, teaching them how to be members of that local society, building a love of learning in them. And there was a lot more free time and freedom for both the teachers' gifts and abilities, as well as for the students to experiment, to learn, to move, freedom in learning. And so that was balanced. That was a balanced way to do it. And that is life, not preparation for life. This is their life, children's life. And we're not teaching them to have a balance. We're teaching them that everything is preparation. You can't waste a minute of instructional time with like a conversation about something, which of course is ridiculous. And teachers try as much as they can to fight that, but it's getting increasingly worse. And I think technology absolutely, of course, can be part of that. Technology needs to be used for higher order thinking. Higher order thinking, that's Education 101 is you're working toward higher order thinking. Analysis, research, creativity, which you mentioned earlier, not for just sitting there and, watching cartoon lessons and absorbing, mindlessly and only using, 2 of your senses, sight and sound. We know that the best learning is multi-sensory. So you're doing, yes, you're watching, you're talking about it, you're seeing it in different modes. And also learning in the brain doesn't even begin until there's a social, emotional connection.
Yes.
And really that's what gets deep learning going. And how you're not going to get that. You're going to have, we already do. We have kids, they're just clicking through what they have to click through to be done with it. They're not enjoying it. They're not absorbing it. It's 2 senses, and and it's really a tragedy.
It's really disrespectful to children because it's not who they are and it's not how they learn. And so we've literally adopted a model of education that's counter to everything that we know about children. And I know as educators, because I'm an educator too, it's like, how do I reconcile really a profession that is being directed that works against the interest of the student?
And I can tell you how. Teachers are faking it. They're faking it. They're filling out the forms. They're saying what they have to do, at least at the elementary level, the ones who really are aware of it. Half the time we're supposed to collect data, and it's like, okay, let's just do that real quick, get it done, get it over with, and now we need to do it the way we know it needs to be done. But it's becoming more and more difficult.
Yeah, and the teachers aren't to blame. And I think a lot of this, unfortunately, has been then turned around against the teachers, because what we're seeing is over a couple of decades is that the achievement gap is widening. Students, we have a lot of research to show that students are less engaged. So back to your point, Heather, if the purpose is citizenship and the key element of citizenship is engagement, and yet we have an educational model that literally disengages the students from their own learning, from their own thinking, from their own creative process. It works, counter to that. But I think you make some good points. I just lost my train of thought. Sorry, sometimes I do that.
Well, that's okay. I want to jump in and add just a little bit more, because these companies need more data so that they can make their programs more like real teachers, so that they can figure out how to get kids more engaged. So now they want even more data. And if you don't mind, I had 2 other really good quotes from that, from Dana Boyd, the Microsoft researcher, that were very telling, that relates to this.
Heather, is it possible for you to post those on the group chat?
Yes.
Okay,
yep.
And then that way we have a record of those. But I just want to, reiterate the 2 things that you said, the 3 things that you said that are really bad for kids in this kind of technology-oriented, modular learning, a digital approach to education, which is freedom of learning. And that's critical. And then the other thing is engagement. And the last thing is that multisensory approach, which, neurologists tell us our kids learn through touching, smelling, seeing, feeling, and all of that is being lost in screen time that just essentially doesn't take place. I want to also say one other thing. I was up at CSU a couple of weeks ago, and one of the instructors was introducing a grant through McGraw-Hill for adaptive learning courseware. And I said, after they were talking about this, and they said, it doesn't get to the higher order thinking of skills of Bloom's taxonomy. And I said, well, then why would we use educational tools, particularly this is happening at a college level, and you're using tools that don't get to those higher levels learning according to Bloom's taxonomy, synthesis, evaluation, application. You're not getting to those. Why would you use those tools? And it's because it becomes a process of efficiency and with limited budgets, and it's systematic and automated. And this is where we're seeing the deprofessionalizing of the teacher profession. And I was talking to a firefighter the other day, and he said, well, we need tests. We need tests to tell us how we're doing. And I said, no, I'm not buying that anymore. I'm sick and tired of hearing that we need data and we need tests to tell us how we're doing. When you pull up to a fire, do you tell someone else, does someone else tell you how to assess and evaluate the situation? And he says, no, that's what we're trained to do. And I said, well, that's what educators are trained to do. We're trained to assess and evaluate and instruct. And because we're being marginalized and deprofessionalized, that job is being reverted to data collectors who, guess what, don't know about education and don't care about children.
Right.
So I'm looking here at questions. Are there parents that had any? I'm not seeing any questions. Is there any question, or shall we move to the wrap-up section? There was one other thing I wanted to add, but if there's a question from parents, I want to make sure we get to that too.
There was a question that Shari had. Shari?
Yes, I was just trying to figure out how to unmute myself. I wanted to ask if there are no laws on algorithms and FERPA doesn't protect against data, then how essentially is FERPA helping or protecting students with the amount of data that's being collected, is the first question. And the second is there a way of knowing with the types of data being collected through online learning or surveys through Naviance, if these vendors are then filtering the student data into the SLDS, or do you think that they're just creating independent data warehouses that link up somewhere?
Sherry, I think that's part of the problem, is we don't know. No one knows. They're not police. They're not regulated. So we don't know exactly what it is that they do with that data. Some contracts reveal that and others don't. And Uniting for Kids went with a group down to Denver to meet with their technology people. And we said, how is this being monitored? How can a parent know? When I file for a credit card, they say these are the terms of the agreement. And yet my kids, we don't know what the terms are. And what they said is it's decentralized. Those school districts, those principals, sometimes those teachers are making those decisions, and there is no way to monitor or regulate that. Is there someone else there were 3 parts to that question, and is there someone else who wants to get to the other part of that?
I could say something to that. I think with a lot of the online learning programs, that data can be handled by something called IMS Global, which is a big consortium of software industry ed tech people. And a lot of that data, that they're tagged in a way that are interoperable between databases and between companies. And so that data that is tagged can then be sorted based on different kinds of algorithms, whatever they want to apply to it, whatever data brokers want to apply to it. I don't think it goes into the SLDS. What a lot of it gets funneled to is something at the national level called the Federal Learning Registry. And the Federal Learning Registry is a joint data gathering project between the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Defense. And the Federal Learning Registry gets most of this data, all of the online ed resources, the free online programs that are given to schools that are Common Core aligned. That online curriculum is handled by Microsoft and Bill Gates and funneled through IMS Global and then up to the Federal Learning Registry as we understand it. So in essence, it does get funneled back and they are able to gather that metadata from different online venues.
So the Federal Learning Registry is actually collecting data then on individual students, not, I was under the impression that it was an overall. In other words, like you can use their site to search for things. I wasn't aware, which now it's blowing my mind, that they're actually collecting individual data.
You can see there's the gentleman from the Federal Learning Registry, Steve Midgley, was on a video explaining how the Federal Learning Registry was going to work. And he said, we can see what this teacher said and how long this teacher said it, what this child did in the classroom, who emailed who, what was done. So that is very much on the student level. That's PII. Okay. What they get, it's not transparent. We don't know. We are not told, but we do know that they have that potential. And would they ever tell us? I don't know. But I think, when I've asked, I've not been told. The idea that information being collected about a person, fair information practices, you should be able to see what data is collected on you and how it's being used. And at this point, we don't know that for children.
Okay. And do you guys know, I guess it doesn't seem to me that FERPA really has any benefit in the school system at all when programs like Naviance, refer to we abide by FERPA. It doesn't really seem like it's applying.
Well, let me just add to that too, Sherry. We attended the meeting at the State Department of Education, and they were talking about the reauthorization of ESSA and the Student Succeeds Act and how that's approached to privacy. Mm-hmm. And so we asked the question of how are you? And they said, well, we need you to know that we're complying with the law. We're complying with that law. And I said, how do we know? And they said, this long song and dance, which basically was reduced down to we're self-reporting. So what we do know is that even if Colorado has a privacy law, but what we don't have are the resources for enforcement. Mm-hmm. And so there is absolutely zero enforcement of student data privacy being done in any state at the local level, at the state level, or at the federal level. If they say that they have protections in place, they may exist in language, but they are not being enforced. And we have no examples throughout the country of consequences of companies that are leaking data. We have examples where they've leaked data, where they violated those vendor agreements, and there's no enforcement.
Wow.
So so I want to be respectful of the time, and we're exceeding our 1 hour, and I know that people just don't pay attention much longer than that. And so what I want to do is give everybody kind of one final comment, and ideally if you can limit that to 1 minute, that would be wonderful. I know that's a tall order. I also want to say that we have this group chat, and I see a lot of great resources that are being shared. We'll go ahead and send a follow-up newsletter. People can sign up at our website at unitingforkids.com. And if you go to the newsletter and subscribe to that, then what we'll provide is the resources that have also been shared in the group chat. And so for those of you that are guests, I just want to say thank you so very much for an enlightening conversation. And all of you are really doing very important, great work. And I know that it's talked about how you become the ugly stepchild when you start asking the questions and challenging a lot of this. But it's really paving the way for more parents to engage and for more teachers to, get the support that they need in terms of advocating in the best interest of kids. So I just want to say thank you so much for your standing up, your speaking out, your looking into things, for coming and sharing your story and your wisdom here with us. And I'm going to turn it over to each one of you. I'm going to close out in the opposite order that we started in terms of those final comments. So Allison, if you'll lead us in the final comments, and then Sherry will close out with you, that'd be great.
Okay, well, I just wanted to add one thing. I think a lot of the data-driven aspect in terms of what we've been talking about is linked to Pay for Success, which is part of ESSA. And they've issued 2 new bonds around English language learning and also workforce development. So it really links it all in together, and the Arnold Foundation is behind that. So I think moving forward, and I'm doing some research around it, but keep in mind social impact investing and Pay for Success with DeVos. We're going to face continued financial instability, and they're going to be looking to public-private partnerships to start supporting education. So I think that's a big piece of why we're seeing all the data.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Next is Deb.
I think not all kids learn the same. They don't all learn at the same pace. However, that's not how they're treating our kids in the schools right now with bringing in all the CBE. So I think we really need to stay on our toes with that. And I like the pay for success that Alice mentioned. That is part of the GEF. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, the Global Education Fund. There's actually a map, and I can share that with you all if you'd like, not right now, but later. But it appears that they're following that map like almost to a T, as we have found out, right, Sherry? So if you're not familiar with that map, this map was created in 2005, and it is now 2017, and they have mapped out every year. And so far, every single thing and every year that they've mapped up to this point, they have done. And that's kind of scary because this map goes out to 2030. And I heard the UN 21 agenda was renamed to Education 2030 or something to that effect. I just found that out today.
Okay. Thank you, Deb. Heather?
Hi, okay. I'm going to reiterate the quote I typed on there, that this was, again, from Dana Boyd from Microsoft Research. She said, this is word for word, people mistakenly assume that personalized means decisions are based on your data alone, but quite to the contrary, the whole point is to put your data in relationship to others. And one of the other things she said that is exactly what we're talking about is that we are not going to get any closer to accountability until our cultural values are clearly defined. And so we have to speak up and say what our cultural values are. And, you know, that's what we're trying to do here. But if we can get more parents to speak up about the value of education and of privacy, then once those are articulated, maybe we can see a little bit more success in this fight.
Yeah, and I'll just say, you know, I don't know that we're ever going to have consensus around that. I think that's one of the challenges, is that we have different purposes for our own learning, and students have, you know, different purposes for their learning. So I think that's a challenge. And one of the things that I remember a Finnish speaker talking about, he said in Finland, we don't use the word accountability. The only word that we use is responsibility. And what we really see in this data management world is a deferring of responsibility and a wanting to assign blame. So what we need to say to legislators, what we need to say to those people that are really trying to influence policy is, what are you going to take responsibility for? Let's quit talking about accountability. Where are you going to take responsibility for making sure our schools are funded, for making sure that our students' information is kept private, for making sure that we're approaching the achievement gap and the, I don't even want to call it the achievement gap, the inequities from an opportunity standpoint, not from a punishment and sanction standpoint. That needs to be our question, is let's forget the accountability. It doesn't exist. It was a profit model from the beginning. It wasn't about improving schools. And if it was, it hasn't worked. So now let's just talk about where are we all going to take responsibility for the well-being of these children and the sustaining of democracy. So sorry for that, Heather, but I loved your quote. What a great quote. And it's not personalized learning, and yet all the media spin is that this is the latest and greatest because you're finally going to get a personalized education. And in fact, what you're going to get is a digital education where your child loses complete freedom and is tracked and predicted in a direction that they might not necessarily want to go. So, Cynthia.
So I'll just mention something which I think is an important message for parents, which is one of the things that I've seen this software and programs try to sell is that they're feeding data back to the teachers that the teachers somehow need in order to change how they teach or what they specifically focus on for your child. And just really, Heather, I've actually heard Heather say this before, but just what a sort of disconnect that is from what real teaching and learning actually is, and that that teachers actually would learn more from the tests that they create themselves, that they grade themselves, when they themselves are seeing what mistakes your kids are learning. And I think that parents, when they see a personalized software program like assess their child and how it's kind of a disconnect, I do think that it really fairly quickly can speak to them that this is different than an actual teacher assessing and then figuring out what your child actually needs. So I guess I mentioned that in terms of ways of getting more parents to understand the language and to recognize what's happening. And I certainly welcome Heather, one of to say it better than I've just said it. But
I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were going to ask me to jump in, but I definitely think that, yeah, teachers don't even look at the data. That we get these colorful graphs and charts, and we're like, yeah, we knew this. We already knew this because we work with your child one-on-one, face-to-face, and we give them immediate feedback. So that's exactly true.
Thank you both. Cynthia? Oh, I'm sorry. We already talked to Cynthia. I'm looking right at Alice. Alice, it's you. I'm looking right at Alice's name and saying Cynthia.
Thanks. First, I just want to say thank you to United for Kids for hosting this, and what a great opportunity it is to connect with folks from across the country. I do think that's how we're going to win this battle, because we are the moms, the dads, the educators. We actually do know our children and our students better than anyone else. I wanted to point out to look in your state. I know that one mom had asked about the FERPA regulation and all of that. That one bill that I mentioned at the beginning, HB 2103, what that bill did is it set up these 3 education research centers in the state of Texas who now legally have access to all of that data. So they've made it legal at a state level. Obama had to change the regulation on the FERPA law. He didn't change the law, he changed the regulation to say that the children's data, teachers' data, can be collected in the name of education research. And then at the state level, laws were passed to set up research centers. So I wanted to just point that out. There's federal things happening that are married, and that's what goes on at those ALEC conventions. They come up with the vision for all of the legislation. And I'll close with this, and I got this from Allison. There was a Israeli guy who is very much involved in predictive analytics. And he was asked, what will happen when the algorithm knows what is better for me than myself? And he said, the authority will shift from the feelings of the individual to the outside algorithms. That's exactly what you're talking about. We're allowing for our children's individual freedom to be stolen from them.
Thank you, Alice. Very well said.
Could you post that quote too, Alice? That was pretty powerful as well.
I will. I posted it already, but I'll post it
again. Oh, okay. If it's there, I'll see it. Thank you.
Okay.
Sherry, final comment from you, dear.
Yes. I just want to say I'm getting kind of emotional here thinking about all these moms, and I'm so grateful to have moms like you that get it and care, and we do this every day trying to tell just one more person and wake up one more person, because the more that we do that, we're saving other people's kids as well as ours. And I think that's the idea behind this, is we're fighting for everyone's children here, because it should be a parent's right to decide what happens to their child and with their child. And we have an administration now that is very much pro-choice. And if I could say one thing to them, I want choice to be a parent choice. I want to be able to decide how my child is taught and what happens with my child's data. And don't let someone else predict and decide for them. And if this administration could do one thing, it would be to repeal that change that weakened that Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act FERPA. If they could repeal that 2011 change and really empower parents to protect their children and put consent back, FERPA would protect our children. And if we could get some sort of enforcement policy, a mechanism like they have in Europe where they don't allow data to be shared, and machine learning cannot happen without a parent's consent, we wouldn't have the algorithms predicting your children. So if our administration cares about children and really does care about choice and privacy, I wish that they would do that one thing and repeal FERPA and give our choice back to parents.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I think that's a good starting point. You know, I'd like to see a move away from state standardized testing and just the use of NAEP to provide some benchmark data, that we're not testing every child every year, every day. I mean, now with competency-based education, where we've literally moved away from statewide tests and they're just tested day in, day out, hour by hour. So I'm not going to look to the legislature to make this right. I think that parents, through just saying that these are my children and we're not participating in something that's damaging and destructive for their education and their future and really the future of democracy, I think that we're going to have to be the pushback. I don't think legislators are going to bring the answer. I wish they would, but I think we've waited for about 15 years, and what we see is it just gets worse and worse and worse. And it really reminds me of the analogy with the margarine, you know, where everybody said margarine is better for you than butter. And so people are eating margarine, buying margarine by the tubs and spreading it on everything. And then all of a sudden we find out, oh my God, that margarine leads to cancer. And there was this, how come we didn't know this? Well, you know, it's because the advertisers told us it was going to be good for us. And that's really the metaphor that I see with this kind of digital learning, is that they say it's going to be good for kids. And I'll just close with this one thought. When we met with a district and their technology person, you know, one of the things that they kept saying is, you know, we're providing, this data offers something, this technology offers something that teachers need and that parents need and that students need. And I said, give me an example. And they said, for example, reading. You know, now with these different analysis, you have a full understanding of that child's complete reading ability that you didn't have before. And I said, baloney. We don't, because if you are in the classroom, what you know is that those tools always have different conclusions. They reach different conclusions. And so what we're left with as students, parents, and educators is conflicting information. And we have tons of examples of that, conflicting conclusions that come back as a result of these tools. But what we did before, what I did in a classroom before all of this one-to-one technology and before the software was telling me how these kids reading, was that I had those students pick an example that they wanted to read, a book of their choice, and they read for 2 or 3 minutes, and or longer than that, 10 minutes, and they recorded that. And then they went back through and they looked at what were the mistakes that they made, what strategies they used as a reader. And when we sat down to reflect on their progress and to evaluate, it wasn't just, you know, some system that was saying, here's how you did. It was those students, part of their evaluation was that they looked at, here's where I was 6 months ago in my reading. Here's where I am now in my 6 months. These are the ways that I've improved. These are the challenges that I continue to have. These are the goals that I want to learn. And in that way, kids are directing their own learning, not data corporations, not policymakers, but students are directing their own learning. And that's what we're learning, what we're losing. We're not only losing accurate and valid tools and time that help us provide better evaluation and information of those students, but they're losing their own ability to be self-reflective in their own learning process. And when they lose that, they will no longer be learners. And that's the big danger in this whole movement towards data and tech, and it has very significant consequences because it shuts down the individual to their own thought process, their own learning process, their own ability to self-monitor and self-evaluate. And so I want to just thank everybody. I could go on and on and on. I know we all can, because it's a really important issue. I want to thank you all for all of the work that you've done. And I want to thank you for your leadership and for being an example for others and for joining us here tonight. If you want to learn more about Uniting for Kids, you can find us at unitingforkids.com. I will go ahead and send out a follow-up newsletter that includes this link. If you would like to provide your contact information, ladies, so that people can follow up with you directly, and if there are any additional resources that you want to make sure to share, we'll include those. So I'm going to hit the stop record, and then I know that we've got some members of our team that we just need to answer a couple of quick questions before we sign off. So I'm going to say thank you to our guests who joined us tonight. We will have another webinar. Oh my gosh, I don't have it in front of me. Does someone know our next webinar date? It's the third Tuesday of the month, I believe. Uh-oh, sorry.
The one with Stephen Krashen?
Yes.
March 14th at 7 p.m.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. March 14th, Stephen Krashen. We're going to be talking about the whole education climate, what to expect, what we can do to challenge the areas like data privacy where it's gone awry. So we invite you to join us for Stephen Krashen. We've got another one after that talking about race and education. And as always, you're invited, and we thank you for your voice. So I'm going to sign off and just say thank you once again. I'm going to end the recording.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
ladies.
And you're welcome to stay on if you'd like for our meeting. Thanks again.
Bye, guys. Thank